On September 28, 2022, Hurricane Ian made landfall near Cayo Costa, Florida, as a Category 4 storm with winds of 150 miles per hour and a storm surge that reached 12 to 18 feet in places. By the time the water receded, officials had a number that still sounds unreal. As many as 7,000 boats displaced or damaged in a single storm. A 65-foot boat named Taboo ended up sitting in a stranger's backyard after tearing loose from its dock, hundreds of feet from where it had been moored the night before. The owner got a quote just to lift it back into the water, $16,200 before any repair work even started, just to move the hull off someone's lawn. That is the moment this story actually begins, and where that boat goes next depends entirely on which of several very different paths it falls into. The first thing that happens to a hurricane-wrecked boat is assessment, and in Florida that job falls partly to state wildlife officers. After Ian, teams assessed more than 2,100 boats within weeks, and identified more than 5,000 still displaced across the hardest hit counties. A dedicated hotline was set up just to help owners locate their own boats, because storm surge had moved so many of them so far from where they were originally moored that owners genuinely could not find them. Some ended up wedged in mangroves. Some were stacked 3 deep in marinas that no longer had functioning docks to tie up to. 4 months after the storm, more than 700 derelict boats were still sitting in the affected area, with only about 2/3 actually removed, a backlog that gives you a real sense of how long this process actually takes on the ground. While officials handle boats blocking public waterways, the boat's actual fate gets decided somewhere else entirely, in an insurance file, weeks or months after the storm has already left the headlines. When a hurricane-damaged boat gets surveyed, insurers calculate whether the repair estimate crosses a specific threshold, generally 75 to 80% of the boat's insured value. Cross that line, and the insurer declares what is called a total constructive loss. At that point, the owner is typically paid out in full for the boat's insured value, and the insurer takes legal ownership of the wreck itself. Here is the part most boat owners do not know until they are in the middle of it. Many policies let the original owner buy the wreck back at its salvage value if they want to gamble on fixing it themselves rather than walking away with a check. If the owner declines that option, the wreck gets handed off to recover whatever value is left in the hull, the engines, or the electronics still salvageable inside it. Florida handles the paperwork differently than most people expect too. Unlike states that issue a distinct salvage title the way they would for a wrecked car, Florida uses what is called a branded title, a permanent designation that stays attached to that specific boat's title history forever and discloses the storm damage to every single future buyer, whether the boat eventually gets state titled or federally documented. That branding is exactly why a boat that looked pristine before a storm can suddenly list for a few $1,000s afterward, sometimes a tenth of what it was worth the week before landfall, and why that discount is a real reflection of documented risk, rather than a random bargain. If you're still with me, hit subscribe, because the part where these boats physically end up is where this gets interesting. A handful of specialized marine liquidators handle a huge share of this inventory after a major storm. The oldest and largest, founded in Fort Lauderdale back in 1988, became the go-to marine remarketing contractor during the savings and loan crisis of 1990, and has since handled more than 40,000 cases total, ranging from routine bank repossessions to major storm inventory. These companies transport storm-wrecked boats to storage yards, catalog, and photograph the damage in detail, and market them through sealed bid auctions, where the highest blind offer wins, with the buyer receiving clear title despite the storm history now permanently branded onto it for life. But a huge number of storm-wrecked boats never make it to a liquidator at all because they physically cannot be moved that far in the immediate aftermath. That's where local marinas come in. After Ian hit, one recreational marina in St. James City, Florida, transformed overnight into what its owner described as a boat emergency room. 15 years of building a normal recreational business had been wiped out in roughly 24 hours, and the work that replaced it looked nothing like what came before. Damaged vessels got towed in, stacked, cataloged, and inspected right there by insurance adjusters, because there was simply nowhere else nearby to put them. A former palm tree nursery on the property became an improvised boat graveyard holding more than 200 vessels awaiting a verdict on their fate. Everything from small runabouts to full sailboats moved in on flatbed trucks, row after row, waiting on paperwork rather than repairs. That kind of makeshift storage yard exists all over the Gulf Coast after every major storm, and it's often the real first stop for a wrecked boat, long before anyone decides whether it gets repaired, liquidated, or scrapped for good. Paying for all of this removal is its own separate machine, and it runs almost entirely on federal disaster relief money rather than local budgets. After Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria in 2018, federal grants totaling $17.2 million went specifically toward marine debris removal across the affected states and territories. A separate national grant program has awarded up to $7.5 million in a single round just for clearing abandoned and derelict vessels, with individual local projects running $50,000 to $1 million each. Without that federal backstop, a huge number of wrecked boats sitting in mangroves and canals after a storm would simply never get pulled out at all, because no single property owner or small marina can absorb that removal cost alone, especially when hundreds of boats need moving at once. For boats too damaged to ever go back on the water, the story shifts entirely to what actually happens to the hull itself. Saltwater submersion is close to a death sentence for wiring, connections, and switches, and marine surveyors generally advise treating any engine that ingested salt water as a replacement rather than a repair, since bearing and internal damage often isn't visible until the engine is already running again and failing weeks or months later, usually far from any warranty and far from the original seller. Roughly 2 to 3% of the entire U.S. recreational boat fleet reaches true end-of-life status every year, somewhere around 200,000 boats, and separate estimates put storm losses alone as high as 65,000 vessels in a single bad hurricane season, a number that gives you some sense of just how much of the annual total comes from weather rather than simple old age. That's the part of the story that used to have no good ending, because a fiberglass hull is a thermoset plastic. It doesn't melt down, and for decades the only real options were abandonment in a marsh, illegal scuttling, until that got banned for shedding microplastics into the water, or burial in a landfill where it will essentially never break down. A real fix started in Rhode Island in 2018 with a pilot program that shreds derelict fiberglass hulls down to roughly 2-inch fragments. Those fragments get shipped to a cement manufacturer in South Carolina, where the resin burns as kiln fuel and the glass fibers melt directly into the cement mix, replacing raw minerals that would otherwise need to be mined. The program processed about 80 short tons of fiberglass this way before it received funding to expand the model into several more coastal states. It's worth being honest that this remains a pilot program, not a fully built national network, and funding gaps have paused parts of it, but it's the first real working answer the industry has had for a problem that previously had none. So here's where a hurricane-wrecked boat actually ends up. It gets found, sometimes through a hotline, sometimes wedged in a stranger's yard. It gets assessed against an insurance threshold that decides whether it lives or becomes a total loss. It gets hauled, often to a makeshift graveyard on a marina's spare lot, long before it ever reaches a formal liquidator. Federal grant money frequently pays for that removal, because no single boat owner or small business could absorb the cost alone. And if it's truly finished, it may end up as the concrete in a building instead of a wreck rotting in a marsh for years. The price tag on a storm damage listing tells you almost nothing on its own. The branded title tells you the boat has already been through this exact process, start to finish, and now you know precisely what that process actually involves before you ever place a bid on one.